The blood drained from Zerk's face, despite the pounding in her chest at the sound of that name. Zerk's. If you were to look up his file, he would be labelled as a simple merchant with a Krixer cargo vessel, just like Duns. The only difference would be the 5-mile-long rap sheet, detailing countless unconfirmed reports of criminal actions, from petty theft to larceny, all the way to grand murder. For those who truly knew him, Zerk was a pure-blooded pirate with the front of a cargo merchant, and a flimsy front at that. To make matters infinitely better, he bore a personal grudge against Dunst. As hard as it was to believe, seeing the difference between them today, Zerk and Dunst had grown up together on the same moon, both children of miners. Mining was perhaps the lowest occupation, as the need for true miners had been replaced by automatons. But robots require maintenance, and biological miners only required a bare minimum of food, which meant that, in the worst conditions, sapient beings still slaved under masters too poor or too cheap to care about the working conditions or safety precautions. On a barren rock or the moon, Zerk and Dunst had spun tales to each other. Tales about how they would one day pool their resources and buy a Krixer. It didn't matter to the two boys that the Krixer was perhaps the slowest and most obsolete model of cargo ship still seen about the galaxy. To them, it was beautiful. With a hope of a dream, which was more than most miners had, Tuns and Zerk pushed themselves harder than any of the other workers. They cared for each other, watched each other, and helped keep each other sane through the long hours of grinding toil. After 4 years of hard work in the mine, which probably shortened their lifespan significantly, they were able to buy a Krixer off of a merchant who had made several bad choices and fallen into bankruptcy. At first it was just them. Then, as Tun's uncanny ability to feel subtle shifts in the markets began to increase their revenues, they began expanding their holdings and their crew. Zerk had been one of the first to join them. Ostensibly, it had been so she would be able to escape the responsibility of inheriting a weapons manufacturing company from her father, but in reality, it had been because she had been drawn to Tuz and Zerk, at the time, attracted equally by both. As she spent more time with Zerk, though, she began to see the arrogance, jealousy, and utter contempt for the weak which Zerk harboured inside himself. His lust drove her closer to Tuz, which only exasperated an already tense situation. Zerk had been in favour of looting cargo ships which had been set upon by hunters. After all, the crew had been unable to repel them and therefore were most likely dead, but the hunters cared little for most commodities, so left those untouched. Tuz resisted him at first, but then agreed it would have been a shame to let the goods go to waste. On the first derelict ship they boarded, it seemed Zerk had been right. Blood from various species had been evident in great quantities, but no living souls were to be found. Then Zerk happened upon a wounded child. It was most likely beyond saving, but Zerk was more worried about what Tuz would do if he discovered someone alive on that ship. So he shot it in the head. Tuz saw. The majority of the crew were loyal to Tuz, though some few fanatically supported Zerk. A fight broke out between the two factions, but Zerk was overwhelmed 3-1. Tuz didn't feel right in killing Zerk as he had killed the child, so left him and his supporters on the broken and dying ship where he had committed his first murder. Before the airlock had closed, Zerk had screamed that he would find Tuz again, and for the betrayal of his trust would take all that he loved. Z's final bloody gaze before the airlock hit his face had been fixed upon Zerk. He hadn't died as both Zerk and Z had hoped. Instead, reports of a group of pirates who masqueraded a cargo vessel began to surface. There was no way to be certain it was Zerk, and the pirates themselves seemed more myth than fact, yet Zerk had felt the reason behind the stories. Now it seemed Z was done biding his time. Dear Journal, I'm a monster. I don't know which kind yet. I was finishing up the last slice of purple Xeno rat pig when Mama Giraffe had stumbled in. She barely even took one look at the room before she added to its olfactory experience. I sure hoped I wouldn't have to sleep in here. She lurched her way back out the door after glancing at the ceiling, stumbling into Severus right outside. Perfect. He was going to suffer from apoplexy the moment he saw this. My fears were soon confirmed as I heard rapid clicking from the blue giraffe. Then I checked myself. there was a different tone to this clicking. A more frantic, panic cast, which had been absent during Severus's previous rants. I quickly took the last bite. It really did taste like chicken if you close your eyes, and hurried over, although what I was going to do I had no idea. Before I was halfway across the room, the entire cargo bay, and I had summarized the entire ship, lurched alarmingly as though it had struck an obstacle. Moments later, the sound of shrieking metal being ripped apart came from the bow of the ship. It was pretty clear to me that we had hit something, but instead of running to where I'd seen the bridge so he could officially take care of the matter, Severus hit a button on his belt and then spoke with the faraway look of someone on the phone. He lifted his finger off the button and then started gallop flailing to the aft of the ship, which was towards the hydroponics bay and, I assumed as I hadn't seen it yet, the engine room. I doubted Severus was such a bad captain that he neglected his duties whenever he hit a piece of space debris, so I quickly revised my hypothesis as to what was happening to pending. When I began hearing screams which sounded funnily like the screams of horses, accompanied by noises which sounded remarkably like rapid pistol fire, except from a ray gun, I decided Severus must have the right idea in mind and hightailed it out of my cargo bay and towards the hydroponics bay. I'd never been in a firefight before in my life, and I didn't think the attackers would be willing to disarm themselves so I could fight them on the familiar ground of bar brawling, or even a friendly game of darts. I saw Mama a few cargo bays behind me, herding a multitude of the children as fast as the slowest could run. Fucking jiggles. I made sure they passed me, looking down the long corridor which allowed passage from the ship proper to the long line of cargo bays. I couldn't see anything, but the screams had also stopped. I think I had almost preferred them to the silence. Jiggles finally got his last vestiges of flab through a door just beyond the one which led to the hydroponics bay, and I followed suit, covering a distance in 2 seconds what had taken the childhood 20. Adrenaline's a hell of a drug. Good thing too, because they had been closing the door the moment Jiggles had got inside. I slammed into the half-closed door and flew into the room. I guess I slammed into the door a little too hard, since it snapped off its hinges and was flung out of Severus's hand to strike the wall to his right. Both of us looked at the door which we had been counting on as a shield, as it slowly peeled itself off the wall to fall with a clang to the floor. "Do you make your hinges out of purple Xeno rat pig bones?" I shouted, as I lifted the door and fit it back in place, using the door frame on my shoulder to keep it set. Then it started taking hits. I was impressed with the solidarity of the door, especially given the frailty of its connections. From this side of the door it sounded as though someone was merely slapping the other side. Granted, they were hard slaps, the kind you get after having a threesome with both your girlfriend's sisters. Dating identical triplets is hard, but they were slaps nonetheless. The slaps began getting faster and slightly harder, as the door began to vibrate alarmingly. Silence suddenly fell, as the shots stopped completely, and then I heard clicking from the other side of the door. I looked to Severus, hoping for some kind of recognizable signal as to what to do. He was pretty clear when he started trying to pull me away. I hoped for all our sakes that he was being gentle on purpose, or else any fighting we'd have to do would be even more one-sided, but I eased up on the door and set it beside the doorframe. Another blue giraffe strode into the room. This one had seen some fights before. One of his arms and 2 of his legs were prosthetic. His stripes were marred by countless small frosty scars. He had the bearing of one used to command and very harsh in discipline, but I couldn't decide if it was of the just or cruel variety. I had been preparing myself to fight for all I was worth, but there was one thing I hadn't expected. This new blue giraffe wore a uniform, as did his shipmates. I saw as 3 of them filed in behind him. Now I had a dilemma. Were these the police? Was this a lawful boarding? For all I knew, my newest family could be a family of thieves and smugglers. I wouldn't have minded too much, but the law's the law, and I wouldn't want to attack these intruders if they turned out to just be men doing their jobs. I observed, trying to catch every detail which would tell me what was going on. I'm gone for 10 years, and the only modification you made to our old ship is another 5 cargo bays? Also, what happened in 9? It looks like someone took an anti-tank pulse gun to a box of dizzy rats, clicked Zerk, striding confidently into the engine room. He looked to his left and saw the ugliest little creature watching him with bright eyes. What have you got here, my old friend? Another weakling? You do love them so. Why, even now, you hide among them while the rest of your crew lies bleeding and dying about your ship. having protected what they thought was a worthy life. Shame. I could have given them so much more. I could have given them pride. He motioned towards the uniforms, a recent acquisition from a cloth trader made specifically for this occasion. Neither am I your friend, nor is he weak, stated Tz, attempting to sound calm, but ruining the illusion by allowing his back leg to shake. It had always shook when they had been friends, and it galled Zerk's to no end that it was only through his motivation and his determination that Tz now stood here, proud among the stars, instead of rotting in a crater on the moon they left so long ago. You're right, Zerk reported. You aren't my friend. If you were, I would be standing before you as an equal rather than a conqueror. I'm glad you tore everything away from me and sent me tumbling through the stars. If you hadn't, I might still be stuck here with you, refusing opportunity after opportunity because of your cowardice, when we could have been living like kings. He finished, in an angry rush, panting as the fury he had kept under control for so long threatened to overflow. Why are you here, Zerk? Tz asked. Fool. Is it to gloat? Not so much a fool then, but still a sizable one. Partially, replied Zerk, but not entirely. I'm here to keep my word because, unlike you, assume my promises to be binding. I'm not going with you, Zerk, replied Zerk. Beautiful Zerk. I will throw myself out of the first airlock before I willingly spend a picosecond in your presence. A shame, that was. If she had been willing to come with him, he would have gladly accepted her. As it was, he would not let her dampen his moment of triumph by making him show his disappointment. He laughed, hoping none had noticed the momentary pause, and clicked. I don't want you anymore. Look at you, a mere shadow of what you once were, and a poor one at that. Stay with Tz. I don't care. I came for what will hurt him the most. His eyes searched among the children, and the lined upon the shortest. The one with the stripes so thin, they seemed to nearly disappear when they reached his face, just like his father. Tz saw Zerk's eyes light up, and understood his purpose. A growl was the only warning his men had before he flew at Zerk on his heels, having attacked a moment later. These were the best of his men, though, and they had quick reflexes. Rong grabbed Tz while he was still in the air, bearing him to the ground, while the other managed to catch Zerk before she could tackle Zungs. He smiled without amusement, then heard a much lower growl resonate from the small, ugly creature to his left. My, he had quite forgotten it was there. Ignoring it, Zerk motioned for the final man who wasn't holding someone to grab the smallest child, while the other two kept his parents in check. The man grabbed the smallest one's arm. Then the world exploded. I had been watching the incoherent conversation like a hawk, but couldn't understand a thing from its participants' body language. Something the alleged police officer said threw Mama and Severus into a rage, which almost made my decision for me, but two of the penning policemen detained the pair without harming either, which is what I'd expect police to do. They seemed rather unnecessarily rough, though. Watch it, I growled to the two holding them down. The officer then motioned towards Dink, which didn't make any sense. What would the officer want with... The third blue giraffe began pulling on Dink's arm, dragging him towards the door. I didn't need any more proof that these giraffes weren't police, and if they were, then I joined the rebel cause instantly. I dive-tackled the scum holding Dink, slamming him into the opposite wall. His ribcage exploded like a watermelon upon the impact, covering me in a purple sludge. The giraffe's scream or curse was cut short, as though with a guillotine. Zerk's man suddenly disappeared in a blur of orange, white, and brown. It took a moment for Zerk's mind to process what had happened. By the time he looked to where his second-in-command lay with his chest pulverized, the small ugly creature had jumped flying through the air to land on top of his chief engineer, snapping his spine with a sickening crunch. As the ferocious beast tore his chief medical officer's throat out, Zerk drew his pulse pistol and fired. I managed to take the other one down before anyone knew what was happening, and scored a lucky hit as I swung an outstretched arm which caught the third ex-police candidate in the throat. I had been too slow, it seemed, because I turned around to find the fake officer pointing a gun at my face. There's a reason bartenders of rowdy pubs keep shotguns under the counter. Guns end the fight. Period. He pulled the trigger, and I saw a blinding flash of light as it struck me right between the eyes. I didn't die. It hurt. Believe me, it hurt. But it wasn't the kind of pain to incapacitate me. It was the kind of pain which was only going to piss me off. My turn, I growled, advancing on the officer. Zerk's fired. It didn't die. His final thought before his skull collapsed was it wasn't so weak after all. I bodily picked up the officer and flung him from the room, jumping after him so I landed above his head the moment he hit the ground. I hadn't realised how angry I was until I started bashing his face with my fists like a deranged gorilla on crystal meth. His head was a purple mush after only a few hits, but I continued to vent my anger on it, obliterating his skull until it was merely a purple stain. Someone slapped me hard on the shoulder. I looked up and was slapped again in the face. 3 enemy giraffes stood 10 meters away, firing ray pistols. Those things were useless. Why did they even bother shooting them? They might as well use them as clubs. I sprinted towards them, feeling as though I were wading through a sea of small angry children as weak-ass ray pulses dissipated harmlessly against my body. As I flung myself into them, mindlessly laying about with my legs and fists as I had oft done during many a senseless brawl, I reflected that I might need to start using cover on my approaches, lest I end up with a nasty bruising, or even a bloody nose. I shouldn't have lost myself in thought, though, because when I checked back into reality, I saw that I had been kicking the lifeless body of one of my opponents needlessly, and systematically breaking every bone in his body for the second time. I started hunting, stalking through the ship, searching every cargo bay. The officer's crew hadn't been merciful to my new family, and the lifeless corpses of several of the ship's crew members lay strewn around the ship. I found one of the gardeners missing an arm, and another without his head. The next few opponents I found suffered similar, yet more profound injuries before I allowed them to expire. Though there wasn't much worse I could do than take off the head, so I used a grammatical loophole to achieve the same result without instantly killing them. I finished with the cargo bays, and came into a large room which housed the port and starboard airlocks. I could see how the criminals had gotten in. The port airlock hatch had been shredded by what could only be a large drill, which was mounted on a mechanical arm in the enemy's ship. The drill had been retracted so that the enemy blue giraffes could easily move between ships, which they were doing when I found them, carrying crates from our ship onto theirs. Seeing them form the word which had already been growing in my mind. Pirates. I slammed into the closest pirate giraffe in the middle of his long back, breaking his spine and neck through whiplash. I picked up the small crate he had dropped and flung it at the next closest pirate, who had apparently skipped both leg and arm day, resulting in his expiration due to his inability to catch a storage crate. The other 7 in the room had noticed me by now. They were so freaking slow, and had drawn their piddle pistols. Another 5 joined their brothers in the void, when they tried to use their party poppers as weapons. The last 2 learned faster though. The Sith tried to use his gun as a club. I gave him kudos for that, but he was still slow and weak. I caught his wrist, disarmed him, turned his gun on him and pulled the trigger, which was oddly on the back of the handle rather than under the barrel. Nothing happened. I guess these guns had security measures to keep someone from doing what I had just done. The security measures weren't all-encompassing, however, since they did prevent me from hurling the gun into my victim's face, where it struck. I was pretty impressed with that, as the butt of a gun isn't strictly made to be used as a knife, but the second and final giraffe pirate had another surprise in store for me. As number 6 crumbled to the floor, number 7 drew a sword from a sheath on his back. The double edge of the blade came alight with burning red heat the moment it left his scabbard. Their guns may have been ineffective, but I doubted my tender skin would appreciate being attacked by an alien lava sword. He swung at me, I backstepped. He swung again and I repeated. He lunged at me, driving forward with a stab. Even though he had a weapon that would have worked on me, I still had him outclassed in the speed department. I sidestepped, grabbed his arm as it passed, then broke it over my knee. He howled, but he didn't have long to contemplate his pain once his sword found its way through his chest and then his neck. I was so happy with my newly acquired sword that I didn't notice the drill powering up until it was almost too late. A solid beam of energy shot towards me, narrowly missing my head as I ducked, and struck the inside hatch of the starboard airlock of our ship, burned through it, then went through the other hatch. An explosive crack sounded from the ship, and both ships, being connected, began moving the atmosphere. I felt myself flying back through the port airlock, but grabbed the edge that was the outside hatch of the port airlock and braced my legs against the edge of the inside hatch, wedging myself into security. My drool-happy friend, however, wasn't so fortunate. Oh, he grabbed the edge just like me. He just didn't have my grip strength, and his hands merely brushed the edge before he flew into my ship and out the other end. Even with my enemy gone, I still had the small problem of a large hole leaking all the oxygen, which I had grown rather accustomed to, out into space, where it could hardly be appreciated. I didn't know it at the time, but I had already fixed the problem. The mangled door to my previous room flew into view, having been sucked into the docking bay from somewhere further inside the ship proper. It was too large to fit through the hole, and, bent over itself by my ministrations, was strong enough to create a temporary bulkhead. Suddenly released from the gravity-defying force of atmosphere under pressure, I eased myself down from the airlock frame before my arms gave out. I searched the pirate ship to see if there were any more, but it seemed as though the raiding party had included everyone on board, except for Twinkletoes, the trigger-happy jackhammer specialist. With the battle, to give it a kind name, over, a wave of weariness washed through me, though more from the adrenaline than any actual physical exertion. It was only now that I was able to survey my handiwork. Oh my,